Hey everybody, how's it going? I just finished rereading Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, which I have not read in probably over 20 years. I think the last time I read it or watched the movie or whatever was back in high school, so it's been a very long time. And I wasn't sure. I remember really liking the book, really disliking the movie, and so I didn't really know what to expect, especially after so many years have gone by. Would it be something that I would discover wasn't as good as I thought it was, or what? And what I found was a very good work with some flaws that I'll get into a little bit of. Um, but I mean, it. One thing that I learned looking at it is that it was actually originally published in 1969, which it seems a lot fresher than that, to be perfectly honest. So what is the Andromeda Strain? It's I think it's one of Crichton's earlier books. This is obviously a paperback reprint from the 1990s, and so, yeah, sometime after 1993, and so all of his other books are kind of like noted here at that point. But this must have been one of his earlier works, and it kind of is his tribute to the rise of biology or biologists in a way. He kind of pokes fun at physicists and chemists throughout the book and talks about how biology is really where things are at now. And it's kind of funny. It's a funny feeling to realize at certain points that you're maybe not being trolled, but being poked fun at by a man from beyond the grave. It is a bit of a strange feeling. So this book is set up as it's almost like a War of the Worlds kind of style, in the sense that it's a non-fictional kind of reporter's tone, with uh, with a significant amount of fakery intended to make it feel like this is actually a report from like a government organization or something like that after the fact. The whole tone of the book is like that. The acknowledgments at the beginning, I believe, are at least partly faked, and the what I discovered, and another point of being trolled from beyond the grave, was that the bibliography at the end is also faked. Which, me, being a scientist, I'm like, I'm going to look up some of these papers. I mean, I thought, maybe these ones who are supposedly by characters in the book are fake, but surely some of these other ones are real. And I tried to track down 6 or 7 of the papers in the bibliography, and they just don't exist. So whatever. Um, it it is a slow paced book over most of it. In fact, the first probably quarter of the book is so slow paced that I'd even call it kind of dull, because it's mostly about the establishment of the organization that goes about doing most of the work in this book. Just to kind of give a little bit of plot synopsis. It's not a story of something landing unexpectedly from the stars. It is the story of a satellite that was put up into orbit. Not a deep space probe, but a satellite that was going to go up into orbit, go around a few times, and come back down. And it was basically going to collect samples of stuff from orbit and bring it back down. So the the impression was that it might bring back microorganisms that are very, very old, something that maybe a meteorite hit on Earth, kicked up into space, and has been circling around for millions of years. That was kind of like the worst case scenario that the people who came up with the idea for this probe, hypothesized. However, this particular probe, as it's spinning around, suddenly its orbit gets messed up, and it starts to go a little funky. It ends up landing in a city, not a city, a little village called Piedmont, Arizona, population 48, and it seems to kill everyone in the city or in the town. And I say seems to because that's not actually true, and it's actually a lot more complicated than that. But basically, this book is a fictional, a fictionalized but non-fictionally toned record of the efforts to isolate, investigate, understand, and counter whatever it is that's on this particular space probe. There are lots of questions that are posed and answered throughout the book. Is it extraterrestrial or not? Is it just something that's very, very old that was maybe like a spore floating in orbit? Maybe, or is it something that is unlike any life that's on Earth, right? That kind of question is something that they go to great deals to try to understand. And not just like, oh, this must be because of blah, 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 blah. But they actually do a lot of really good, like, scientific detail to show kind of what I think is a fairly realistic set of tests and stuff that these scientists did, including some mistakes that they made in the process. There's a well, I'll get to it in a second. And the other questions that they're trying to answer is like, why or how is this thing lethal? Is it actually lethal? What can be done to prevent it? What will happen if this thing kind of gets out? How do we prevent it from getting out? And it's like after you get past the first quarter of the book, which is mostly kind of a description of like how this organization got funded to, potentially explore or study any extraterrestrial microorganism that appears on Earth for whatever reason. Once we get into the actual kind of action, the story becomes it's still slow-paced, but relatively, but there's a nice tension in the atmosphere that makes it interesting to read after that first, quarter of the book or so. Great thing about this book is that there's tons of realistic science stuff, which is both a good thing and a bit of an issue because there are some mistakes that are, I think, worth noting. There's a lot of real science stuff, like, amino acid sequencing, growth media of like putting a microorganism on to a plate of agar and seeing what it does, kind of thing. Experiments and tests that real scientists actually do would do if they were dealing with a situation like this. And these real elements are mixed up with a bunch of very cleverly fictionalized elements as well. Just to give an example of something that is realistic but fictional, early in the book, they're kind of flying over the top of this town, and they observe that all the people there are dead, but there are vultures starting to go after their bodies, and they're like, well, we gotta kill those vultures. So they drop a gas that they call chlorazine in the book, which actually surprisingly is now the name of some drug that was recently produced. I guess they didn't think about possible fictional versions of the same name when they came up with the name for the drug. But anyway, they describe this chlorazine gas as what's called an uncoupler. And an uncoupler is an actual real toxicity pathway for a toxin to do damage. Basically, what it does is it prevents the body from taking adenosine diphosphate and converting it back to adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is the compound that kind of serves as like the fuel supply for cells. And so whenever a cell does something that consumes energy, what often happens is that one of the phosphates gets pulled off of the adenosine triphosphate, and it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. What an uncoupler does is it prevents the cells from replenishing their supplies of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and then it basically causes overheating of the body and death as the energy just kind of gets all burned out, and there's nothing for the cell metabolism is no longer serving a useful purpose, but it just causes the body to overheat and the victim to die. Now, the funny thing about this is that uncouplers are a real thing. In fact, one of the early FDA bans was of a diet drug that was actually an uncoupler, and it causes serious problems in human metabolism too. And so that's what makes this a plot hole. If they drop a gas that is an uncoupler that kills vultures in a couple of minutes, people exposed to that gas would probably also die. So kind of a little bit of a plot hole there. There really shouldn't have been anyone who survived that, even if there was anyone still running around in the city. Another interesting thing is that when they talk about growing the organism, whatever it happens to be, on different media, that works. It grows on anything. But that's also contradicted by later on what turns out to be kind of the trick to stopping this stuff. And I'm not going to spoil that, but it turns out that that's also another fairly significant plot hole. Basically, if the growth was dependent on this particular element of the growth medium, then it would not have grown on all these other growth media. It would only have grown on a couple of them. So I think that's another interesting little plot inconsistency or plot hole. Another cool thing about this is that it's a lesson on multivariate problems. When you have something that you don't know what it is at all, and you're dealing with a complex, system like a biological system, there's all kinds of different things that you can test. You can test dependence on temperature, dependence on oxygen partial pressure, dependence on nitrogen partial pressure, dependence on carbon dioxide partial pressure. That's just atmosphere, right? Humidity, light levels. There's all kinds of different things you can test. And something that a lot of science fiction doesn't acknowledge is how rapidly this multivariate problem becomes basically untenable. You might say you wanted to try, 5 different points of each variable. Well, if you have 2 different variables, well, now you have 25 points to take, 25 data points. That's not so bad. But if you have 3, then you have 125. With 4, you have 625. It increases geometrically with the number of variables. And so physicists love to simplify things to single variables, or to like 1 or 2 variables, maybe 3, right? But in a biological system, you can't do that. You've got all these different, environmental variables that you have to account for, all of them. And so it's very easy, imagine that you're creating an experiment space where, okay, so here's 5 points on a line. That's our first variable. If we take those 5 points on a line and turn them into 25 points in a square, now we have 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 125 points in a cube. And then you go to hypercube, super hypercube, hyper super hypercube, whatever they call those higher dimensional abstractions, right? But you end up with this problem where you have this many dimensional structure, and it's very easy to have like a little gap over here, right? And it's unlikely, but it's possible that the important information that you want is in this little gap somewhere in that experimental structure. And that's kind of one of the things that this book really hammers in about the difficulty of doing, biological studies on something that you don't know anything about, right? A lot of biological studies are on things that we know a lot about, or that are similar to things that we care about, right? You do biological tests on the hearts of pigs because the hearts of pigs are very similar to human hearts, kind of thing. It's a really fascinating kind of like mini study of that problem, and that's something that as a scientist I love to see. There was a really fun moment where, should I spoil it? Maybe I shouldn't spoil it. They do this one particular test. I'm not going to say what it is, but they do this one particular test. And another thing that's really cool in this book is that there's a lot of like charts. So something like that, right? So they have, an output map set that's like the actual geological or geographical maps. And then they have an updated map that like takes into account like wind direction and stuff like that, population centers. And so there's a lot of like cool fictionalized charts and plots and stuff like that you can look at and kind of enjoy from the perspective of a scientist. And one of the tests that they do, it was great because I didn't remember exactly how this went because I saw they're talking about they're preparing this test, they're doing this test, and then they give you the chart with the readout, and I read through the readout, and I'm like, well, shit. That was my genuine reaction to it, and I just thought that was very, very fun. After the fact, of course. Um, it's once you get past that first quarter where things are kind of like, and then the government did this thing to fund this thing, and there were meetings in Congress and blah 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 blah. And it's a little like actually dull. Once you actually get into the action of people actually trying to explore stuff and investigate stuff, then you've got that consistent slow burn tension, and it's really nice. But at the very end of the book, there's kind of there's a very rushed ending, and there's almost no like falling action or mop up afterwards. The story just kind of, action goes from slow tension to what, and then the book ends. And you're like, what? I would say that's one of the major like pacing issues that this book has, is that the beginning is dull and the ending is so abrupt that it's almost hard to find it satisfying. The middle part is great though. Let's see. There were a bunch of funny things in this book too. Like one of the people that is involved in this situation is a like a old drunk guy, an old drunkard guy who's drinking. I had to look it up. He says he's drinking Sterno, and I didn't know what Sterno was. Sterno is, those little canisters that have a cap and they have like a jelly stuff inside that you can light, and it creates like a little mini stove, like a portable mini stove. That's Sterno. And apparently what that is it's denatured alcohol with a jellying agent to make it not pourable, right? And so apparently that's a combination of ethanol and methanol, and it used to be a thing back in the Great Depression era for people to strain the alcohol out of Sterno and use it to get intoxicated, at the significant risk of their health because it's denatured alcohol. It's got methanol in it, and so you can have some serious problems from that. But this character's name is Peter Jackson. I was like, wait, is that what? Look it up. It's like, yeah, it's a total coincidence. But yeah, this character has the same name as the guy who did the Lord of the Rings movies, right? There's another one where one of the main characters' name is Stone, and I believe they're describing him as kind of being having bad relationships with women. He's like on his fourth marriage, and I'm pretty sure they say that his current wife is the daughter of Indiana Senator Thomas Wayne. And I'm like, so that makes this like a Batman alternate history kind of thing? I don't know. I thought it was really funny that there was just a bunch of these little coincidences in the book that met up with other totally unrelated pop culture stuff. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention is that there was this great point where they're like using a microscope to look at something, and it's kind of like there's a lot of cool futurism in this book. There's a lot of cool ideas of like medical or experimental apparatus that are automated or mechanized in certain ways that I think are really kind of neat to look at and think about. But one of them is kind of like it's a microscope basically, but it's automated in the sense that it'll scan over an area. And there was something in there that actually was like, whoa, did this like curl into my head and pop out later on? Because what they do is they're scanning something and they find this little fleck of like stone or something like that, and they're like, oh, we want to investigate that. But then the guy who's in charge is like, no, this is great. We see it here. We'll zoom in later, but continue to scan. And there's actually a moment just like that in the early part of my novel, Pursuit of the Heliotrope, where they're looking for evidence of the ship out in space. And so they're doing basically a near-infrared and visual scan of the sky around them, and they observe a couple of pixels that shouldn't be there, and they're like, well, maybe we should zoom in, and the main character is like, note it, mark down where it is, but continue the scan. And I wonder if that was something that like this book influenced me 20 some years ago, and I came up with that as a cool idea, or if I came up with it originally, I don't know. But anyway, I thought that was fun. Anyway, it's short. It's a pretty quick read, honestly. Despite the fact that it's full of a lot of, well, I might not be a good. I mean, it's a quick read for someone who knows a lot of who has a good grasp of like scientific instrumentation and stuff like that. It might be a little slower of a read for someone who is like an educated layman. I don't know, but it is a relatively short book. So I mean, it's definitely worth going through and reading, because it's not 500 pages of stuff. They spend that first fifth or quarter of the book being a little bit dull, but the lion's share of the book is this really nice, tense, slow burn with a lot of really cool, realistic, scientific stuff happening. So yeah, I am more satisfied with this book now than when I read it back in the day, because now I have the knowledge to appreciate a lot of the things that are going on, and the not just the futurism, but the level of detail that Crichton uses in the book. I really appreciate the fact that he's poking fun at physicists, because I don't know, it's a very weird feeling to be trolled by a man who has passed away, but it's kind of a funny feeling, like he's still there laughing at me, kind of thing. Especially when I was on Google Scholar and various other like paper, scientific paper collection things, looking for these papers in the big bibliography and not finding a single damn one of them. It's great, because here it is. There's the references page, right? References. And you can see that some of them are like, author, Stone J et al., right? Okay, fine. That's probably a fictional article because it's written by one of the characters in the book. But then you have stuff like, oh, well, there's a paper by a Bagdell R.L., Prevailing Winds in the Southwest United States, from Government Weather Review, volume 81, pages 291 through 299. Even that's not real. So he's got, 20, 40, 50, 60. He's got 60 papers here, which I think most of them are actually fabricated. Some of them are for journals that don't exist, and some of them are for journals that do exist. There's a couple of books in here, books, and I think there's a couple of science papers and stuff like that. But I think it's all fake, which got me again after all of his poking fun at physicists. My instinct to go look at this bibliography was another little troll that, I laughed. So yeah, if you like realistic science stuff, like not just like crazy out there science fiction, but like if you like an actual taste of real, like what a real scientist or medical doctor would think of in a certain in an outlandish situation, this book might be second to none. It's just fantastic in that sense. Aside from a couple of plot holes and a little bit of weird pacing at the beginning and the end, it's a great book. And because it's so short, it's very quick to get through those parts that are relatively poorly paced. But yeah, that's what I've got for today for you. The Andromeda Strain. Fantastic book. There was actually a sequel written by someone else, I think, after Crichton passed away. I might have to check that one out. Anyway, so with that, I'll say thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. As always, if you like what I'm doing and you want to help the channel out, you know what to do. And I will see you next time with, well, we'll see what it is. Anyway, have a good one.